all the things I talked about on development issues, access to justice, this issue of actually doing something to deal with missing people, just some closure on that, it may be one of the most important parts in reconciliation. And if you've gone through, seen the worst things that a war can do, and I didn't serve in the military, but after being resident coordinator in Sri Lanka in the middle of the war, I felt like I was serving in the military at times. And I worked very closely with a number of Sri Lankan generals too, but being friends with. You don't want to see that happen again. And that's the responsibility that a society has, it's a responsibility which the international partners of the country have to try to make sure that doesn't happen again. So that's a few lessons, maybe a bit more personalized than they should be, but I hope it's helpful to your deliberations today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mujibur. I think our deliberations for the second day have started off on a very good note with your multiple identities and multiple experiences and your hands-on experiences. I think there's a lot for us to learn. We are presently at the cusp of the post-conflict stage, although the conflict hasn't ended, but I think we are already talking about what will happen after the conflict ends. And as you rightly pointed out, the army is worried, the government is worried, the corps commanders have discussed it, and they want the work to begin on how to handle the post-conflict situation. So I think your personal experiences, we record them, and if you have some negative tips, we would like to give it to us so we can put it to the book that we are going to give. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kashif, for getting over here. And so the next speaker on the line is the lady in the beautiful sari from Sri Lanka. Anton is here. So yes, Anton is here. I'm sorry. So I thought it should be ladies first, but nonetheless. Anthony from the Open University.
By the way, one of the most positive things about Sri Lankan society is that there's actually a higher number of university graduates who are women than men. Education rates are better, and you can argue that there's still not enough women in management positions, but in terms of education, it's fantastic.
100% literacy rate.
100% literacy rate, but actually more women in university than men.
If you learn more about our university, you'll find similar statistics over there, and we have got a young colleague sitting over there who belongs to our university. So, brief introduction for our next worthy speaker, Mr. Anton Pialatne. I believe he and Zahid Shahab Ahmed go along with their work together in Nepal, where they make very good friends. I don't know whether they are still Facebook friends or not. We are. You are. So, Mr. Pialatne is a senior lecturer in anthropology, that's his field, sociology in the Open University of Sri Lanka, and he is also a PhD candidate from Macquarie University. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Good morning to you all. I'm going to make my presentation on this interesting theme. As UN President representative highlighted here, my focus, being an anthropologist, my focus is always about how people interact. People's, how minds are united, how people interact with the post-conflict situation. In a context, especially during Mahinda Rajapaksa's government, there's not much ground-level initiatives to construct peace. So, that is the context in which my presentation should be understood. In this presentation, I will explain to you how multi-ethnic members of community Sri Lanka engage in everyday struggle to reconstruct or construct a home in the post-conflict Sri Lanka. As you all aware, the Sri Lanka had a nearly 3-decade-long ethnic conflict, and which was ended in the month of May 2009. So this really destroyed most of the socio-economic and demographic resources which were meant for the development of the country. Yes, so with that introduction, so this is how I outline my presentation. So Sri Lanka is an island. So this is where Sri Lanka located close to Dolo. Sometimes people misunderstand us as Indians, they don't identify country like Sri Lanka. So anyway, we have around 20 million people. We have, Sinhalese, Sri Lankan Tamil, Indian Tamil, Muslims, Malays, Burghers, and ethnic others, which has around 20 to 30 different ethnic categories. So we have, Hindus, Buddhists, Islam, Christians, and all. We have high literacy rate, around 96%, and also our life expectancy is higher. Of course, after the war, should be more than that. So we have better health facilities. Sri Lanka is frequently portrayed as a country burdened with an ethnic conflict. You might have heard about the 3-decade long ethnic war between the Sri Lankan government forces as well as with the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Freedom called LTTE. This LTTE group fought for the rights of the Tamil community, Sri Lankan Tamil community, and also their intention was to establish separate state called Elam for the Sri Lankan Tamil community. So please be mindful of the fact that we have another Tamil group in Sri Lanka, Indian Tamil community. So they were not talking about the rights of the Indian Tamil communities who are basically settled in the plantation sector in Sri Lanka. So this war really ended in 2009, creating a lot of allegations, human rights allegations on human rights violation and all. As our resident representatives of UNO pointed out, that there are a lot of discussions in the UNHRC level. Even recently ended UNHRC session, there's a lot of discussion on that. So, of course, for last battle, Pakistan supported Sri Lanka amidst of India really pulled their support. So Sri Lankans are grateful to Pakistan for that. So anyway, that's So Sri Lanka state happened to engage in external battle, diplomatic battle, while involving in internal war with the so-called terrorists. So that's not my own labeling. Anyway, so popular discussion really suggests Sri Lankans' life is impossible. Communities are torn apart. Sinhalese hate Tamils hate Muslims, Sinhalese hate Muslims and all. That's a popular discussion, right? So now I'm altogether focusing to a different aspect of human relationship. Yes. So these are kind of pictorial explanation of the war. I don't need to explain you, so you all know about it.
That picture at the bottom right
Yes.
is of a series of cabinet ministers sitting in the
That's right.
south.
Yes.
And I know a number of them as well. One is one of the leading Muslim cabinet ministers at the time.
That's right, Ashraf. Yes.
Ashraf and Fauzi,
Yes,
he's in the middle.
Yes, that's right.
And it's a terrible.
Yeah, this is the last pictorial explanation of the last battle. Yes, so, when you look at the ethnic groups, history of ethnicities in Sri Lanka, I consider today's, ethnic conflict has roots in the colonial histories. I consider today's, rigid ethnic boundary creation is an invention of colonials and also maintenance of the post-colonial local political elites, right? So before the colonials, of course, we have our history of 450 years, proud history of Portuguese, Dutch, and British in Sri Lanka. So they, before they came to Sri Lanka, we had kind of fluid identities, caste, religion, kinship, and some other local, regional-based identities. But there are division, there's no clashes, right? Then, what did colonial masters do? For their administrative purposes, they had scientific enumeration, census taking and all. They created hard, rigid ethno-racial categories for their administrative purposes. And that is really connected to the politics of the country, political administration of it. So by the time when British left the country in 1948, we had clearly, ethnically divided groups who are connected to political administration of the country. So the local elites after 1948, they had kind of ethno-racial interest, and they didn't have kind of interest on creating broader ethno-nationalism like maybe Pakistan or Singaporean or Australian, right? So this division continued, and I really believe that really discussion ended in creating LTTE. Tamil political leaders diplomatically tried to get their rights. That failed, right? that failed, and that will led for the rise of the LTTE, military movement. Okay, so it started in 1980 and militarily ended in 2009. Of course, extensive literature review and also my own personal experience. I lived throughout the war and also Sinhala youth rebel. Politicization of ethnicity and ethnic relationships have been contributed for this conflict situation. The post-war Sri Lanka, really headed by President Mahinda Rajapaksa, did not pay adequate attention on combining, linking minds of Sinhala mindset with the Sinhala minds with the Muslim minds with the Tamil minds. Peace is ultimately how people live together, how peacefully people can live. So he didn't take satisfactory effort to create peace, and my research really took place for about 2 years under his regime between 2010, mid of 2010 to 2012. It's 2 years long research, extensive field work in 4 research locations. Anyway, this situation really warrants us to think of constructivist approach to understand Sri Lankan situation. This is kind of, anthropologists, giant anthropologists who address the issue of ethnicity. The problem of South Asia, maybe for that matter, the international approach is really confusing and complex with regard to ethnicity. Ethnic identity cannot apply to each and every person as one blanket category. My Sinhala-ness may be totally different to the Sinhala-ness of Kumari, right? So my Sinhala-ness represents Tamils, especially plantation Tamil. My Sinhala-ness represents Sufi Islamism in Sri Lanka. My Sinhala-ness represents Hinduism. I'm really a mixture of all these sort of, chaotic cultural traditions. So that is a problem. Now we have a couple of situations. Whenever people meet Tamil, okay, is a possible entity. Whenever people meet a Muslim, is a possible terrorist. That's not the case. People are different, right? Ethnicity should be understood according to context. That differs person to person, situation to situation. That is the that is the theoretical approach giant anthropologists suggested. So this guy, Frederick Barth, really he started discussing ethnic boundary, right? How people maintain ethnic boundaries, how rigid that is, how that can be made transgressible, how can that be made porous. So that is how where Barth started discussion of ethnicity. He was highlighting situational nature of ethnicity, and that was supported by Birmingham, Hans and Gowers, etc. This researcher Simon Harrison always talked about cultural differences as denied resemblance. We always talk about the Muslim studies, Tamil studies, Sinhala studies. We are talking about differences. When we talk the differences, we forget the similarities. We have a lot of similarities. We have a lot of resemblance, right? We forget. The other researcher, Nepotistos, especially in Macedonian background, he was talking about how ethnic relationship is possible in a crisis situation. So my theoretical background was really drawn from borrowed concepts of these giants. For my research, I really focused, I carved out my own research concept, theory or concept, called common ground. When I was drawing, developing this concept, I used the 2 theoretical giants, let's say Pierre Bourdieu's discussion of habitats, and also Michael Jackson, not the singer but anthropologist, his view on existential and intersubjectivity nature of human being. So based on these 2 giants' theoretical explanations, I developed this concept, common grounds, for my research purpose. So now I believe that is a struggle to construct hope. This is a construction of social space in which people can cooperate, people can collaborate. It essentially may not create peace, but there are maybe fight everyday basis, fight with regard to the boundary of the land or various issues. So this common ground is a space in which people can engage in everyday discussion, engage in everyday activity. They have security at home. Right. So that is how I identify common ground, which is I identify for this purpose as home. Home is a place where you are assured safety. It's a space in which you feel comfortable and convenient. People live without the sense of insecurity, and also which assures welfare and well-being of the present living people, and also their future generation with a sense of belongingness. Right. So that is home. Of course, as I suggested earlier, my research, I did my research in 4 research locations, 2 locations in the city of Colombo, 2 locations in the eastern part of the country where the war really happened. And since I can't take much of the time here, I really focus here, 2 research locations. So the first research location is Pro Island, an island in Colombo, a northern part of Colombo. There are people, some middle class community, Sinhalese, Tamils, Muslims live there. So naturally, being middle class members of the society, they always organize in terms of kind of institutions. They have a lot of institutions to address various issues of the community. My intervention, or I researched one of the societies called Beach Park Management Society, which is the biggest society. Their main intention was to maintain the beach park, right? Beach park. In a way, it's a effort to create a space in which Sinhalese, Tamils, Muslims, all the communities can go there and enjoy their life. So these people make daily basis, during jogging sessions, during voluntary gift of labor to develop a beach and all. And these people have a lot of lifestyle similarities that should be understood in the sense of body or sense of taste. And they all belong to emerging middle class in the Colombo. And yes, as I explained earlier, they gather around formal bodies. They also have multicultural and accommodative culture and also ethos. They are multicultural. They are Muslims, Sinhalese, Hindus, Buddhists, but they have a kind of common culture in which they all can unite. That is something constructed, invented. They gave up talking about separation, referring to the ethnic conflict. They were talking about decoration, beautifying the beach, right? Creating better social space. So they had common objective: beach, how to manage the beach, how to develop the area, how to make sure the welfare of the community, right? They had basically common lifestyle aspirations, how to maintain better body and all, right? Then they engage in annual parties, end of the year parties, different parties. They just need a cause to have a party, right? Annual picnic, they engage in annual picnics, conducting various festivals. They had mixed marriages. So the bond created through formal bodies were extended to the personal family spheres as well, right? So they mutually participated for common events of each other's. Buddhists took part, Muslims events, and also Hindus. It's kind of a combination, right? So this shows how a group of community, middle class community, construct their own space in which they can live in harmony in the middle class setting around. So second social space, I don't talk much about that. This is one of the urban Shanti communities which mainly involved in 1983 riot against Tamil community in Sri Lanka because of the third social space I discuss is Pothubil in the eastern province. So this is a community which has Muslim majority, Sinhala minority. Sinhala is the national majority. In this community, Sinhala are the minority, and also Tamils are the minority in this context. So I don't talk much about that, but I would like to highlight a special phenomena called Grease Devil phenomena, which happened during this period, especially during Mahinda Rajapaksa's period. We all, Sinhalese, Tamils, Muslims, all believe myths, right? This mythical episode created Grease Devil phenomena. Now there's a myth, a devil or demon coming in the night to the houses where there are women living alone and try to suck, they suck blood out of the breast of women. So which created a lot of fear among, in the minds of the people in the country. This happened around the country, but I was in Portugal during this period. I was, narrowly escaped, in most of the situations because people were frightened about the strangers who are coming to their communities. And most of the time people found these devil or these men who were, who applied the grease on their bodies, running to the military bases, right, where they were trying to capture the grease devils. So there's a lot of suspicion created in the minds of Muslims in the Eastern community, Eastern Sri Lanka. This is something created by government in order to create a lot of terror among the people. Right? So this was badly influenced in the mind of the people it created suspicions. One community created one community suspected other community, and also they were questioning about the effort of the state. Right. So the last space, social space called Panama, there I spent 2 years, but I had a data, but for this presentation I focused on one pilgrimage called pilgrimage on food or Kataragama Padayatra. There's this is connected to a god called Kataragama Murugan. Sinhalas were him, Tamils and also Muslims. Muslims consider him as Al-Qasim, Al-Ghizl, so green man. The god called Murugan came from India and he came to Sri Lanka. He was just for a visit. We came to Pakistan, so short visit. And he got friendly with one of those local Vedas, indigenous, girl of a local indigenous community called Wali, and he got friendly with him and he settled there. So his Indian consort tried harder to get him back, but he didn't come. And Indian consort also went back to Sri Lanka and settled there. And a special religious site was created called Kataragama. They are the main religious shrine rooms have constructed for God Kataragama and also Goddess Valiyamma and Goddess Devanamma. In the month of July, August, this pilgrimage happened. People from around the country visit this place to worship God Kataragama. A special pilgrimage takes place from Jaffna, which is the center of LTTE, to deep south of the country, which is dominated by majority Sinhala people. So it's a walk for about 450 kilometers. They walk along the coastal line, which take many days. So from Panama, where I was doing my research, it was around 105 kilometers from there to Kataragama. I took part in this pilgrimage. It took around 8 days. So Sinhalas, Tamils take part in the pilgrimage. They don't talk about ethnic clans and all. They are going through the deep forest of the Kataragama Yara National Park. Of course, this happened even during there's a situation. LTT was fully controlling the deep forest. They accommodated this pilgrimage because LTT members, though they had a lot of modern weapons, they are afraid of God's hegemony, right? And also there's a situation. LTT controlled half of the forest, other half was controlled by Sri Lankan government forces. They both allowed these pilgrimages to go, engage in to visit God Kataragama. During this period, people, they discard all their, lay loyalties. They don't talk about anything, bad. They don't hate others. They always try to be having pure mindset, right? Pure mindset. They don't hate others because that would make, they have a notion of pure and impure concept. If they get impure, that is called killer, which makes angry of the god, right? You don't want to make the god angry, right? If a Tamil man talk anything against Sinhalas, that he makes himself impure. So they didn't do so, right? So they all have different good and bad practices, and they all engage in good practices to please the god in order to get his blessings. This pilgrimage involved a lot of uncertainties, attacks from wild bears, wild jumbos and all. They all followed God's path. They are afraid of pollution, killer, as I explained earlier. There's a desperate need of getting blessed of the god. And they all identified as Samis, irrespective of their ethno-racial background. became the followers of the code. All follow similar rituals, respect for broader human values, common objectives. Sinhala man got little bit of courage from the Tamil man. And during this pilgrimage, of course, Muslims were also having a lot of support. They were giving a lot of support, extending support to the Tamil and Sinhala pilgrims. Muslims have opened shops in the religious sites, so I believe Muslims do follow a lot of rituals. So, coming to the end of this presentation. In this presentation, what I highlighted was not the elite's effort, not the politicians' effort, but the not the efforts of international communities. Right? What I highlighted is the efforts of everyday struggle of the community, members of the community to create peace, and that is the cultural dimension of this. Of the creation of peace in the post-conflict society. So we have to understand this. If we don't understand this, that would not be assuring eternal peace. Thank you very much.
David. So, Dr. Pierre, sorry to cut you short from your excellent presentation. Gave us a peek into the very rich and diverse culture of Sri Lanka, and the ritual that you showed us about the Karanama Padayatra that the Muslims and Tamils and Buddhists undertake together. I have had the experience of climbing the Adams Peak, and I thought personally that I was going on a penance, that I was going there to purify my soul, and I saw many Buddhists walking on their knees, being carried on the back, and it was something which I could relate to, so I can totally understand your anthropological angle when you say that constructing homes can be finding similarities rather than dissimilarity. So thank you very much once again for your excellent presentation, and Dr. Kashif Saeed Khan has to make a small housekeeping.
Yeah, we are breaking off for tea and refreshments in the basement. So we come back in 15 minutes or 20 minutes. We come back at 11. It will make it a bit quick.
Yeah. So as they say on the television, don't go, come back at 11.
Hey, we'll be there.
So thank you very much, and after this we have the two ladies, so we'll come back and listen to them.
So we start strictly at 11 o'clock. Can you please make it quick?
After a couple of excellent presentations, this morning, we are into the second phase of the third session of the conference, and we have with us now Ms. Saida Basu. She, as I mentioned earlier, is a young colleague of ours. She teaches in S3. And she has co-authored with two other young ladies, Fiza Hajam and Shifa Fatma, thesis on socio-economic consequences of conflict in North Vista Agency. She's going to talk about it, but she's going to talk about it to the other panelists will be sitting with us, and maybe they'll handle the question and answers together with Saida. Over to you, Saida.
It was basically, this paper is derived from our BS Economics project that was supervised by me, Saida Batul, and was done by Ms. Shifa Fatma and Ms. Fiza Najam, that they're sitting right there. And this was basically a research funded by USIP, that's United States Institute of Peace. And this, what I felt today and yesterday is that one aspect is still lacking in this conference, and that is economics aspect. And after this presentation, you will also be pleased to listen to the economics aspect of conflicts. So our topic is socio-economic consequences of conflict in North Waziristan Agency, and one of our fellow presenter has discussed the same issue with the aspect of, I think, South Waziristan Agency. Okay. So we know there are different reasons for emergence of conflict, that they can occur because of territorial gain, it can occur because of religious problems. But the most unlucky thing is that most of these conflicts are occurring in low-income countries, but they have global ripple effects. Now, conflict, when it occurs, it leads to to displacements, which in turn leads to poverty. So that means conflict is a major obstacle to development, and we have seen that all those countries who are facing conflicts, they have a very low progress in achieving Millennium Development Goals. So Pakistan has faced many conflicts, and currently Pakistan is again facing several distinct but interrelated conflicts, both internationally and domestically. So we can see one conflict was East and West split. Still, Pakistan is facing sectarian conflicts. We have Kashmir issue, and the most dangerous one is domestic terrorism and extremism. And if you talk about domestic terrorism and extremism, over the past decade, a severe conflict has emerged in northwestern part of the country, which has caused a massive internal displacement and which has threatened the human welfare in terms of loss of opportunities and loss of occupation. So this study investigated the socio-economic consequences of displacement in the North Waziristan Agency, which has occurred because of the operation that is tagged as Zarb-e-Azm. Okay, if we see the existing studies, we know whenever a conflict occurs, it can disturb your income sources. It can be a threat to the livestock, as the study mentioned has shown. It can be a threat to the education because it's going to disturb school enrollment rate. It can also disturb your health facilities, and obviously all these things will be related to multidimensional poverty, and studies have shown a strong link between MPI, which is a measure of multidimensional poverty, and conflict. So that means all these studies and all these results motivate us to see the same kind of relationship between socio-economic opportunities and conflict for Pakistan. So what was the research gap? We saw that unluckily Pakistan is also facing a conflict, so we need to investigate the same kind of quantitative studies that can tell you in terms of socio-economic consequences, because there are very few studies for Pakistan that have been conducted, but we have seen that just like Sri Lanka, we have seen many studies, many researchers coming up with the findings of the conflict in Sri Lanka, and I think in this conference we have, there are so many studies that have been conducted for Sri Lanka. But unluckily we have, as this field is new for Pakistan, so we needed to conduct this study to find a relationship between economics aspect and the conflicts. So there are 4 research objectives. The first important research objective was to compare the pre- and post-conflict living patterns of the displaced persons. So basically this is going to be a comparative study, how was the living standard before the conflict and how it has affected the post-conflict situation. The second objective is to assess the intensity of losses sustained by these households. The third important objective was to investigate post-conflict economic status of internally displaced persons who are living in camps. And the fourth, again, interesting aspect of this study is to see how IDPs are perceiving their future. So basically if you see, the first 3 objectives are quantitative one, and the fourth is based on the perceptions of IDPs. And as this is a new study, new research area, so we have conducted an exploratory study, and this exploratory study is based on a sample of 200 households. So after this results, we will be able to answer these questions: that was there a significant change in the socio-economic status of displaced persons? Did displaced households face considerable losses due to displacement? Are migrants households experiencing significant deprivation in camps? And have IDPs developed a negative perception about their future? So how we have proceeded with our research questions is to see how the living patterns have changed. We have focused 2 kinds of socio-economic status. One is that is linked with the income source, that is occupation status, and the other is the education status. To focus on the income source or the occupation status, we were interested in seeing how their income or opportunities have changed, whether they have been converted from independent source of income to dependent source of income, or from one sort of independent source of income to another sort of independent source of income, or they were already dependents and now they have converted into another dependent sort of income, or their situation is still the same. That means the income source is still the same. The second aspect is education status. That is about how their school enrollment rate has changed after displacement. Whether the school enrollment rate has increased or it has decreased because of this displacement. To answer a second question, that was about the loss of assets, we have used Likert scale, that is measuring the loss of assets from low loss level to a high loss level. So we have quantified all sorts of assets related to health, physical or human, and then we have measured how many percentage of people are facing low loss and how much were facing a high kind of loss. Then to get more insight, we have developed an index that has measured the dimensions of all the losses. So you can see we have given weight to 1/3 weight to human loss, 1/27 weight to physical loss because we have taken 9 different sorts of assets, and then we have given 1/6 weightage to opportunity loss because we have taken 2 different indicators for opportunities that have been lost because of this displacement. Then to answer our third question, that was measuring multidimensional deprivation on the basis of multidimensional poverty index, we have taken all the indicators of MPI, that is education, health and living standard. For measuring the educational opportunities, we have seen enrollment in school, whether the individuals are deprived from school or not after displacement. So basically this third question is their current condition in camp. Therefore health, we have seen are they facing any food shortage in the camp or not, and again whether they are available with some good sort of health facilities in the camp or not. And first, revisiting the living standards, we have seen how many people are living in one camp or house, what is the source of drinking water they are having right now, what is the kind of sanitation facilities they are having right now, what kind of cooking fuel they are having, and are they available with some sort of electricity provision or not. So basically, if you are familiar with multidimensional poverty index, so all these indicators have been the most important if you want to reduce poverty. And if you have faced a conflict, then because of this internal displacement, obviously the aggregate level of poverty in your country will be increasing. And the most important, the most interesting one was perception analysis. To see what IDPs are thinking about themselves and about their future, we asked these different questions. How conflict has affected your asset structure? Has there been any assistance provided in your camp? Does education lead to better life, what they think still after conflict? How peaceful do you expect your area to be over the next year? And whose role is effective in establishing peace? Whether it's non-government agencies, government agencies or military that is going to bring peace in the area. So this is just a descriptive stats about their families, that how many people. Interesting one is, you can see still who are living in FATA, North Waziristan agencies, most of the people are going to formal schooling system against our perception as we perceive that they must be going to madrasas, but they were going to formal schooling system. Again, highest education was obtained by the males in the households. Many people are having the household size from 5 to 10, and head of the households don't have good years of schooling, but the next generation is having the right mix of years of schooling of education. Now see how their living patterns have changed. Very, you can say depressive findings in terms of employment in the camps, because 76.39 people are now dependents. Or you can see from this last table that how many independents have now converted into dependent sort of sources of income. 81% are now dependent on NGOs or their relatives or maybe any other source. Okay? But only 2.78% are still having the same source of income, and 7.41 are still having the same status as they were having before displacement. Another important is, as keynote speaker also said about education, we can still see this last table, that enrollment after displacement and enrollment before displacement. Still has not affected education that much because 75.2% are still enrolled in school. Okay? And there are some interesting findings that those who were not enrolled in school before the conflict were given the schooling facilities in camps, and they were enrolled after displacement as well. Again, in terms of our loss, destruction of dwellings was the major loss. Livestock has faced a major loss, and loss of crop income, loss of transportation means, and the most important thing again, Mr. Keynote speaker was talking about loss of documentations. Okay? So if they've lost their documents, obviously if they want justice in the future, that will be disturbed. If they don't have the right certificates of their properties or for anything they would have before displacement. But luckily, if we see about human loss, only 17% face the loss of any member of the household in terms of injury or death. Otherwise, 84% have faced no death loss, although they have faced loss in terms of assets. But in terms of loss of opportunities, we classified opportunities in terms of employment opportunities available or any opportunity maybe in terms of access to input market or access to output market. In that level, we see only 74% lost their employment opportunities, but only 9% are saying that those who are connected to the markets for making their maybe products to sell in the market, 9.7% have lost that opportunities. And again, if we see in terms of intensity of loss, around 17% have faced from low to medium loss, and only 11.1% have faced a high level of loss in all the aspects of assets. Okay. Then we measured, to project for the whole population of IDPs, we measured the multidimensional loss index in terms of severity of loss. So you can see the encircled figure, that's percentage of population who are facing severe losses. So 11% were facing severe losses. And if we project it for all the population of IDPs, so we can see that out of 36,831 families, 4,051 families are facing severe losses. Now, the next question was about their socio-economic status, that how many were having a safe drinking water, good sanitation facilities, good cooking fuel facilities, or maybe having a good lighting source, or maybe having non-congested livings. You can see that 54% have said that they are not having any right kind of source for drinking water. 55.5% said they are not having a proper kind of sanitation facilities. 89.35% said, of course we know we are living in camp, they are not having any good cooking fuel facilities, sophisticated one maybe in terms of gas or coal. And 62.5% said that they are not having a right kind of source of lighting, and 53.24% said they are using candles as the source of lighting. And majority of people are living with 5 to 8% in one camp, or maybe 4 to 5% in one camp, and you can see from the encircled figure that is 38.46. Luckily, again, it was a good thing that 88.26% are not facing any kind of food shortage, because we know all the different sorts of help that was given was in terms of food materials. Maybe for the that was the only thing targeted by governments, non-governments or private agencies to provide right kind of food to the people in camps. And then 42% are saying that they are having still a good facility of medical doctor. And 45% said that they have to travel less than 1 kilometer to get to the nearest health facility. Otherwise, they have to travel maybe around 3 kilometers to get right kind of health facility. And then we do ask about the time spent in line waiting for the doctors. And 24% said they still have to wait more than 2 hours to get to the doctor to get checked. And in terms of amount, so I think it's not visible, in terms of amount, 87% said that they still have to pay more than 100 rupees for getting the right kind of facility. But when we converted all these aspects in terms of multidimensional poverty index, this was surprisingly sad that 82% are facing severe kind of deprivation in the dimensions we have mentioned. sanitation, water, cooking, lighting, and medical facilities. And you can see that if we project it for all the IDPs, that out of 36,831 families, 2001 families are facing severe deprivation in the resident area after the conflict. That means camp life still needs a serious attention of governments and non-government agencies to provide them right kind of socio-economic things or to improve their socio-economic well-being. Okay, that was all the quantitative story. That was based on the questionnaire on the statistical technique. Then we directly asked the question, instead of relying on the figures on the statistical tools, let's simply ask them what they feel about themselves. So when we asked them how the conflict has affected your asset structure, it is around 88% said that yes, it got worse. When we asked about that, because we living in Islamabad or in these non-FATA areas, we think that the people living in FATA are still having some dislikeness for formal education. But when we asked about their belief on education for the better life, 93% said yes, they believe on formal schooling to improve their well-being, which was very interesting finding, which was against our perception. Then, how peaceful do you expect your area to be in the next year? Again, we here think that the people are very depressed because we talked about some psychological or emotional feelings of those who have been displaced because of conflict. 85%, around 85% still said that they're expecting their area to be peaceful in the near future. Okay? And when they were asked, then whom do you think is going to be responsible for bringing peace back to your area? We have asked about either it's the tribal elders or the political agents or the Taliban or the army or the local people. So you can see that mostly people still believe, like 44.6% said that it's going to be the army who is going to bring back the peace to the area, and around 41% said that it's going to be the tribal elders who are going to sort this issue and from whom they are expecting to bring peace back. Whereas they have no hopes from political agents and obviously no hopes from Taliban. So, what we concluded from this exploratory research, which was quantitative in nature, targeting the socio-economic aspects, was that there is a significant change in the living standard patterns, occupational patterns of internally displaced persons. However, enrollment rates in school have not changed considerably. Answer for our second objective was that yes, migrants' households have faced significant collateral damages, and majority of the population has faced losses in terms of physical assets instead of in terms of lives. And yes, life in the camp is still not good because internally displaced persons are facing substantial deprivation in camps, which needs the concern of our political leaders or maybe non-governmental agencies. And then the IDPs still generally have a positive outlook about this situation, and they're expecting a lot from their elders, tribal elders, and from army. So, still, we can't ignore limitations of study. One is the time constraint, because we are not still able to conduct long interviews. We have just made specific questions and just take the specific answers. And what policy recommendations we can see from this is, obviously that means conflict has gone, conflict is still there, but IDPs still needs rehabilitation facilities, and they're looking towards us, towards army, or towards whosoever is responsible for this conflict. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Saida. Thank you, Shikha. Thank you, Shifa. You brought out some ways that people are interested in formal education, and more so, there is that positive outlook that people say that things will get better, whether that's based on religion or whether it's based on the other ways, the resilient spirit. I don't know, perhaps in your next research you'll find out why people are still hopeful, despite suffering so much devastation and despite the fact that things are still not stabilized. So thank you very much for an excellent presentation, and I'm sure you and your very able assistants will be asked some very pertinent questions. So last but not least, will you go on? Yeah. So we have Ms. Kumari Karadinya. She's a senior lecturer, Department of Sociology, University of Carolina. She obtained her BA special degree in sociology from the same university which she teaches now in 1998. Title of her undergraduate thesis was Recent Suicide Trends in Sri Lanka. So you invented the suicide bombers, and unfortunately they picked up this propensity for suicide bombing from the time of the counter-terrorism. She was awarded the Dr. Stanley G. Abisinge Memorial Gold Medal and the Hilmi Manzil Prize for Best Graduate in Sociology. Congratulations, ma'am. She completed an MA from the same university in 2001, and then she was awarded the SIDA/SARIC scholarship and completed a degree of licentiate of philosophy equivalent to MPhil in Peace and Development Research at the University of Gothenburg, Sweden. In 2008, her thesis was War-Affected Children in Sri Lanka. Currently, she is doing a PhD in Peace and Development Research, University of Gothenburg, Sweden, and her topic is what the name War-Affected Children in Psychosocial Rehabilitation in Sri Lanka. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you for the introduction.
Or shall you provided it to me?
Okay, good morning everybody. My topic is community-based psychosocial rehabilitation for war-affected children in Sri Lanka. Actually, the study of war-affected children in Sri Lanka was the first part of my PhD. This is not really a PhD regarding the PhD, but it is a little bit related. So I will not talk about our conflict in Sri Lanka because it's quite famous. At the same time, my colleague gave some introduction regarding that. The aim of this paper is to examine and evaluate the community-based psychosocial rehabilitation programs that work with war-affected children in Sri Lanka. As we said, as you all know, although the war has officially ended in 2009, the effects of the war will be children will face the challenges of this war more than a few decades. For example, according to the researchers, nearly 1 million children have been affected by war. Actually, basic problems among them identified as lack of food, loss of parents, displacement, health, and loss of education. Some of the prominent organizations such as UNICEF, WHO, and UNESCO help in them, but they focused on general services such as physical restoration rather than psychosocial or social restorations. However, when I was in 2005 in East and North and some LGT control area, I identified that few community-based psychosocial rehabilitation programs were operating in unpopular way, but they are doing a remarkable jobs there. But unfortunately, nobody recognized their activities. I feel that even government didn't know about their activities. So no broader dialogue on the subject within the country at that time, even today. So therefore I saw this as a gap in the psychosocial discourse and a good place to start to give some input by analyzing what they are currently or in that time doing and what they can do more to develop psychosocial rehabilitation in war-affected children in Sri Lanka. So my main objectives, I have 3 objectives. First one is to understand and document overall scope and operation of different rehabilitation programs. The second one is to critically analyze their activities, and the third one is to assess the short and long-term impact made by them. Actually, I did my field work in the East and Central North provinces. I started in 2005 actually. This is, I didn't collected data in that time, but I was there. That's how I recognized the important contribution that they make. Three groups were interviewed, qualitative interview used as the main data gathering method, and three groups were interviewed, children. The second one is staff members and leaders of the programs, and the third group was community members, school teachers, adults, parents of the children. So theoretical framework actually to analyze their activities and the impact and even understand their activities. I had to build up a theoretical framework. So I went through so many literature. Through the literature review, and I reviewed three programs, psychosocial rehabilitation programs that operated in worldwide. One from Liberia, one from Sierra Leone, and other one from Sri Lanka. Through that, actually, I built up through two theoretical framework. One is to understand their activities. The second one is to analyze their impact. To understand their activities, I identified four components. First one is assessment, second one is planning, third one is implementation, and fourth one is monitoring. Actually, researchers prove that you have to assess children's background before recruiting them, because in a war context, all may be affected by war, but you have to understand. Who are the real needy children. So it was the first. We have to view first priority. Planning means how they find money, how they plan their objectives, and implementation means what kind of methods they apply for rehabilitation. The second one is how we can analyze impact. I identified four criteria: how they fulfill children's basic needs, maybe food, cloth, and what kind of mechanism they use for empower children, education and reconciliation activities, and how they contribute to strengthen the social context, and how they develop children's psychological background. So, therefore, I use these two frameworks to analyze my own three programs. So I selected three programs from, as I said earlier, Mudita Psychosocial Rehabilitation Program is the first one. Actually, this program is very specialized program because it was started by a Buddhist monk. Because as my colleague said, during the war, actually, Sinhalese and Tamil hate each other. But in this instance, Buddhist monks started a rehabilitation program for mainly Tamil children. When the study was done, there are 8 children. 90% of them were Tamil, came from Jaffna, Kilinochchi, and Northern province, and 10% were Sinhalese. At the same time, the only staff member is Buddhist monk, and his mother helping him. At the same time, this program recruit only boys since it is operated in a Buddhist temple. So girls cannot live in a temple according to tradition in Sri Lanka. So programmatic structure, so I use the components that I identified through literature review. Assessment, actually in this program, there is no possibility to assess children's situation before recruiting the children, because children come by their own. If children lose their parents and lovely ones, so if they get to know about the program, they come to the program. So monk take care of them. So planning,